The NRA and the Republican Party want Americans to believe that the Second Amendment gives every American the right to own any gun they want, anywhere they want. But the truth is that the entire gun craze taking place in America is based on a flawed Supreme Court ruling and a well-funded campaign by the NRA. Joining me now to discuss this issue is Howard Nations. So Howard, we have in America today where anybody that wants a gun, regardless of whether or not they can pass a background check, they can go get one. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing so many more of these mass shootings. A lot of great writers, Heather Digby Parton, one of them, have written about this. And what's really coming out now is the entire history, not just where we've come from, but where we are. So let's start by talking about where we are today in America with regards to the entire misinterpretation of the Second Amendment.
Well, right now we're having a fundamental battle between the right of the government to regulate guns and the right of citizens to bear arms. And in Isla Vista, the parents obviously responded with gun control. The right wing responded with fundraising. And then, of course, the great constitutional expert of the right wing, Joe the Plumber, said, "Your dead kids don't trump my constitutional rights." And then a Republican candidate, Jody Ernst, for running for the Senate in Iowa, who had done some TV advertising showing her shooting guns and so forth, referred to this as this unfortunate accident. But then she also said that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right, which raises the whole issue of, is in fact the Second Amendment a fundamental right? Now, I have to tell you where I'm coming from. Full disclosure here, Farron. I'm a lawyer and a hunter. I'm a hunter. I've hunted lions in Africa, bear and pheasants and elk in Idaho, but I'm also a lawyer who has read the Constitution and who has read the cases interpreting the Second Amendment. And I much prefer to get my interpretation of the Second Amendment from the United States Supreme Court rather than from Joe the Plumber.
Well, okay, in any of your hunting trips, have you ever used an AR-15 to go out and shoot pheasant or shoot deer? And that's a lot where the distinction comes in, is people think that the Second Amendment, I can own and I should own and I have the right to own anything I want. And, there's a big difference between having a handgun or a shotgun you use for hunting, handgun in your home to protect your home, than having these, massive arsenals of assault rifles that we are seeing. We're seeing images come out almost every day of these crazy, right-wing nut jobs is really the only way to describe them. They're showing up at Chili's restaurants. They're showing up at Applebee's saying, I should be able to bring this assault rifle with me into your restaurant because the Constitution says I can. But, you pointed out, you are a lawyer, you have been to law school, you have tried many cases, you know the law a lot better than these guys carrying the guns with. And what does the Second Amendment really say? What has the court said about it?
Well, it's very interesting that this, quote, fundamental right to bear arms traces all the way back to 2008 in the case in which Justice Scalia, in writing an opinion for the 5-4 decision, the usual split on the Supreme Court, wrote that the right to guns in the home cannot be regulated. The question was whether a regulation that was passed by the District of Columbia trying to regulate the use of guns or even possessing guns in the home was constitutional. For the first time ever, the United States Supreme Court recognized that the individual had a right to own guns in their own home. But even Justice Scalia, who represents the far right wing of the United States Supreme Court, said that the regulation of firearms and of conduct is within the purview of the state, and the use of concealed weapons and barring use in certain places may be regulated. So the battle of the state versus the individual rights has narrowed down to the Supreme Court has recognized the right to own a gun in your own home, and that's all of 6 years old now.
And, Scalia, we should also point out, obviously, he's a hunter, used to go hunting with Dick Cheney all the time.
Right.
And Dick Cheney, when it comes to guns, he's the guy who shot his best friend in the face.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's when Scalia quit hunting with him.
yeah, I would too. So I mean, these guys, they're not just sitting up there against Scalia. I don't want to defend him by any means, but he knows guns. He knows how to use guns. He uses guns, and he still recognizes, even with as twisted as most of his rulings are, he says, well, look, this really applies to self-defense. Keep it in your home. Don't go parading around with it. So I guess the question now is, how did we get to the point that we're at? What happened, throughout the years that brought us here?
Well, what's happened is started with the NRA. The Second Amendment Foundation and the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms are the first one to espouse this as a fundamental right. As we've seen, the result has been mass shootings, and now we have laws passed by the states, which they can do, saying that you can have guns in the public, in churches, in bars, in schools. I wouldn't be surprised if in the next legislative session they make carrying a gun mandatory in Texas. But we've got to the point where killing teenagers for the offense of being black in Florida makes the shooter a celebrity to the right wing. The shooter now signs autographs at gun shows. What's wrong with that picture? But what's interesting is how the NRA accomplished this. They go all the way back to Lincoln, who said, when you're molding public opinion, public sentiment is everything. The lesson they have learned, and we can all learn from it now, every other organization can learn from it. If you want to win in court of law, you first must win in the court of public opinion. And that's exactly what the NRA has done with respect to this idea of the right to keep and bear arms being a fundamental right, which it never was.
And the NRA, they weren't always like this. Back when they first came out, I forget the year, it was the 20s or the 40s, the NRA was very pro-gun control. They wanted to make sure that, responsible people were able to get guns, and that those people used safety first, I guess, is always the way to say it. The NRA was a responsible organization. But then, as you mentioned, these other groups came in and started twisting around what the NRA stood for. And that has morphed into the NRA of today, and that started taking place in the 70s and 80s. And they don't get it. What the American public doesn't get about it is that these groups are all funded by the gun industry,
right?
By the ammunition manufacturers. This is nothing more than their attempt to drive a profit. This has nothing to do with the Constitution, but they cling to the Constitution because you can't mess with that. Forget the fact that we've lost our ability to not be searched from the NSA. We've lost a lot of our First Amendment rights under the Patriot Act as well. Those amendments don't matter. The only thing that matters to Republicans is the Second Amendment. And again, this is all based on this flawed interpretation that they have. The courts haven't even necessarily said this. They have done this in their own heads, correct?
Right. If you go back and look at the history of the Second Amendment, first of all, what the Second Amendment actually says is that a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, what that referred to, the only part that the NRA likes to quote is the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But that all arose out of the militia, the right of the militia to keep and bear arms, because this came back from 1789 after the passage of the Constitution. Constitutional power shifted to a centralized government. The anti-federalists feared the disarmament of state militias. The state militias were extremely important to each of the 13 states. They were citizen soldiers. They were so important that every white male aged 16 to 60 had to be in the militia, and they had to bring their own weapon. When James Madison decided to run for Congress, he was the leader, of course, of the Federalists, wrote the Federalist Papers. He agreed that he would amend the Constitution. His entire background, he wrote the Second Amendment. The background on it clearly refers only to the militia. It never mentions individual rights. The Constitutional Convention, the ratification process, the House markup never mentions individual rights. For 2 centuries, you've had lots of guns and regulations, no mention of individual rights. The Supreme Court history on this is fascinating. 4 times from 1876 to 1939, the Supreme Court of the United States declined to hold that the Second Amendment protects individual gun ownership outside of the militia. Along came the NRA, and when they had the coup in the NRA, when the NRA came, the coup took place in 1977. They decided they were going to move to Colorado because they were all about hunting. They had no interest in politics. There was a revolution, they call it the Revolution at Cincinnati. They were taken over by the Second Amendment Foundation and the Citizens Committee for the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. This new leadership became very dramatic and dogmatic and ideological, and they're the ones that introduced the concept of the love of the Second Amendment and this total fascination and total need to protect the individual fundamental right of the individual citizens to keep and bear arms.
And as you brought up, Madison wanted to protect the right of the militia, and I think what's very important about that also is the fact that the United States at the time, they did not have a standing army. The state militias were all that we had. So yes, that obviously makes a lot more sense than right now when we have one of the largest militaries in the entire world out there to protect us. Nobody's worried about, terrorists coming into their home and shooting them. At this point, it's your crazy neighbor, the crazy kid down the street. I mean, those are the people that we need to be worried about, and that's why they say, well, if you're worried about it, you go get a gun. More guns doesn't ever solve the problem here, and the Supreme Court, of all places, I know we've spent a lot of time on this show talking about how dysfunctional they have become, but even those minds, those conservatives' minds, they get it, and they have gotten it for quite a while, haven't they?
Yeah, they really have. Let me tell you where this really changed. In 1972, the Republican convention platform supported gun control. In 1975, Ronald Reagan wrote in Guns and Ammo magazine, at the time he was considering a run for the presidency, that the Second Amendment is clear, or ought to be. It appears to leave little, if any, leeway for the gun control advocate. So he wants to take away any leeway. Now, in 1980, the Republican platform changed and said, we believe the right of citizens to keep and bear arms must be preserved. So it became sacrosanct in the 80 Republican convention. Now, I want to contrast that to another Republican, another very far right-wing Republican, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Warren Burger, a Nixon appointee, who said that the Second Amendment has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have seen in my lifetime. He said that in 1990, after all the Reagan years of trying to make this a fundamental right. So the lessons we can all learn from this is that change in America, such as marriage equality, legalized marijuana, undoing campaign finance laws, that the progressives have learned the lesson also. It's moving the minds of the public. It's the lesson that Lincoln knew back in 1860, that if you move the minds of the public, that the legislation will follow. Well, so it's a good lesson for everyone.
I think we've had enough examples of why we need gun control in recent years, and I think the public's opinion is certainly turning on this. And Howard, thank you so much for being here to tell us the story today.